For this week's garden update, I'll show you how I start my tomatoes. I absolutely love tomatoes. One of the great joys for me is coming out to the garden and getting a big, fine, ripened, fresh tomato off the plant and just eating it. I can eat so many. And because I love so many tomatoes, last year was the first year I actually had space to grow a garden, and I went a little crazy. I got over 25 different heirloom varieties of tomatoes, and I grew 2 or 3 of each plant. So I had way over 50 tomato plants. And when they all started to ripen, I couldn't give them away fast enough. I couldn't feed them to the chickens fast enough. We had to compost or throw away good tomatoes just because I grew too many. So this year I'm going to change things up a little. After last year, I really could narrow down which varieties I love and will want to grow again, and the ones that were okay and I maybe won't grow again. So when all these plants ripen, I'll do an update and show you each variety and what's unique about it and how good they taste. One of the problems I had last year is I grew so many different tomatoes, but the varieties I selected were the big heirloom juicy kind that have a lot of flavor, but not the best for tomato sauce or marinara sauce. So this year I'm cutting the number of the big juicy ones in half to just my favorite, and then half I'm growing is going to be a really good variety for making tomato sauce. I got it from Baker Creek. It's called an Amish paste tomato, and I'll show you what that looks like when it's ripe. And my wife will do some canning videos because I'm growing a lot of those plants and we'll have plenty to do canning and preserve for the winter. Now, when I first started growing tomatoes many years ago, I had some problems. A lot of my tomatoes would get a rot on the blossom end of it, and I've adjusted some things. So I'll show you some tricks on how I start and grow really good tomatoes. There's different ways of doing it, but for me, this is what has worked. And there's different kinds of tomatoes. There's determinate and indeterminate, the ones that will climb. And so for the ones that will climb, I put in a fence. That way I can train them up this fence, and by the end of the summer, this whole fence from one end to the other is going to be nothing but these huge tomato vines. And a big important factor is the varieties that you select. Some varieties are more prone to disease and some aren't. Another big problem is overwatering or watering on the leaves and plants itself. I've learned that if I only water at the base and don't overwater them, they have a lot less disease issues. And so for much of my garden, I now do this drip irrigation system, and it's right at the base of each plant. And they have these little control knobs here that I can control how many gallons of water per week go on it. And I also have a timer on my hose. Really important because I can save so much time. I just hook up the hose, have it run for a certain amount of time, and I know how many gallons each plant is getting per week. And I'm not spending a lot of time running around with the hose watering each plant. That just takes away from the fun of gardening when you're spending all your time watering. The other big problem is weeding. When you have good soil and you water, undesirable plants and weeds are just going to want to grow in amongst your crops. So I'm a big proponent of drip irrigation, controlling the water, and mulching. So I save all the grass clippings when I clip my yard, and I know it's better for the yard to leave them in place, but I view this as a valuable resource. Every plant I use is my own natural compost, and then I mulch with the grass. So I cover all around the base of that plant, and no weeds can grow up. Now I start my own plants in pots. You can go to the hardware store or garden center and get varieties of tomatoes, but I like to select my own, get the seeds. I start them about a month before I'm ready to plant them outside in these little trays here, and I have really good success growing plants. And the trick I do is I wait till about mid-May. It starts to get pretty hot, but I have the plants all ready to plant. And what I do is I wait till they're about this tall, and it might seem counterproductive, but I've learned that if I nip off all these leaves here, except for the very top, it really helps in the long run. I produce way more tomatoes if I do that. And this is kind of a funny example of why I do that. I planted the seed in this pot, but the vine fell over, touched another little slot that didn't have any plants in it, and it completely rooted. This whole vine of the tomato plant will put out roots if it's touching dirt. So what I do is, instead of just burying the roots that I have, I bury about 85% of the whole stem underground. And that way this whole area will grow roots, and I'll have a much stronger plant in the end. If I just planted with the stem above ground, I have a tiny root system, and I've done tests in the past where I've had the same size plant, one with just the roots and the whole plant above, and one with the whole plant stripped of leaves and planted underground. And even though this was so much shorter, in the long run it grew a bigger, healthier tomato plant that produced more fruit. So by taking all those leaves and planting the whole stem underground, you're really helping production. I also learned that having really good nutrients available to your plants is important for maximizing production and resisting disease. Tomatoes, a guy told me once to add a little bone meal high in phosphorus and nitrogen, slow release. And since I started doing that, I have not had many problems with some of the diseases I was dealing with, and I have really great tomatoes. So I just spread a little bone meal right in the bottom of the hole as I'm about to plant. I also like to add some good fresh organic matter. I dig down into the compost pile and get some of that grass that's just starting to rot, and I mix that in with the soil. So it has a lot of organic matter and a lot of nitrogen in here that's going to be slow release. If you use chemical fertilizer, you can over fertilize and burn your plant, but not with these composts. It's great. So I mix that in with the existing soil and that phosphorus, the bone dust there, and then I'm just ready to plant my tomato. Now I've also learned that these have been inside in the greenhouse, and when they first get into the sunlight, the leaves start to turn a little yellow and sunburn. So I like to acclimate them a little bit. I set the whole tray out in the sun for longer and longer periods until they can withstand pretty much all day. The leaves turn a little yellow and take a little bit of shock when you transplant them, but they almost always bounce out of it, especially if you give them enough water. So I'm going to take this whole tomato plant, this whole stem, the roots, and put it deep down into the ground, and that way I can grow a really strong, healthy tomato plant. And as these start to grow, I'll train them up onto this fence here, and by later in the summer we'll have more tomatoes than we know what to do with. So that's how I grow tomatoes. I'm going to show you all the varieties, some really unique varieties of different colors when they ripen, and I'll show you how I train them. But for now, that's how I plant tomatoes.